All right, so we've got this really interesting article from the United Daily News, September 23rd, and it's about some pretty serious accusations. But here's the thing. It's about President Lai Ching-te, right? But it goes way back, like over 10 years ago, back to when he was mayor of Tainan.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we're talking about urban development, but then you've got local politics, national regulations. It all kind of gets tangled up together.
Totally. So basically the accusation is that Lai, when he was mayor, approved this, well, massive increase in the floor area ratio, we're talking FAR here, for a development project. And get this, a whopping 220% increase.
Wow, 220%. That's...
It's huge, right?
Yeah.
No wonder media personality Mao Jiaqing and KMT member Lian Hongqing, they slapped a lawsuit down. They're claiming this whole thing was basically an illegal gift.
And, when you hear a number like 220%,
Yeah.
it definitely makes you pay attention. But to really understand how big of a deal this could be, we got to break down FI for a sec.
Exactly, because it's not something everyone thinks about every day.
Right. So imagine you've got a plot of land, okay? FA basically determines how much you can build on that land, how high you can go, how big the structure can be. Higher FAR means more space, which usually translates to bigger profits for developers.
So a 220% jump, that's not just like adding a balcony, that's a whole lot of extra building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, people are going to have questions about that.
Now, the Tainan City Government, they've issued a response, and their whole defense rests on when all of this went down. They're saying back in 2009, when they put this policy in place, there weren't any national limits on these kinds of development incentives. Yeah, they're claiming it was all above board, a way to encourage growth in certain parts of Tainan.
And that's important to consider, the timing of everything.
Yeah.
Because things change, right? The article mentions that in 2014, national regulations came in and put a cap on those FAR increases. Suddenly, it's not a free-for-all anymore. There's a 20% limit.
And Tainan says they've been following those rules ever since.
Right. So the big question is, did Lai's actions happen before or after that 2014 cap? That's where things get murky.
It's like everything hinges on that one detail.
Yeah.
The article, it doesn't actually name which project benefited from this policy, but it does make a connection to the ongoing case of Kuomintang.
Oh, really?
Yeah, kind of hinting that there might be a double standard here in how these situations are being handled. What do you make of that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because now it's not just about legal stuff.
Yeah.
Bringing in Kuomintang, it feels very political, especially with the election coming up. This could be a way to damage Lai's reputation, make voters think twice.
It's like a game of chess, and this news article is just one move. And speaking of moves, the article also links to other related articles, like it's all part of a bigger story that's being told. But before we dive into all the political stuff, I'm curious, how common were these big development incentives in Taiwan back then before those national rules changed in 2014?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this article, it doesn't really dig into that historical context. But it does make a really crucial point about local and national regulations in Taiwan.
Okay, don't leave us hanging. What's the crucial point?
Well, it seems like local governments in Taiwan, they have some wiggle room, some autonomy in how they handle development. But the national regulations, those are the big boss. And those can change, which can create a real mess, especially when you're talking about accusations from years ago.
So Tainan is basically saying, hey, we were just playing by the rules of the game back then, while the accusers are saying, yeah, but a 220% increase, that's not just playing the game, that's cheating.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the context of how development worked back then, the whole political climate of the early 2010s in Taiwan, that's essential if we're going to figure out if these accusations hold any water. This whole thing, it reminds me of something, another case from around the same time. Smaller city, down south, they use these huge FIR adjustments, trying to attract some big investors. But it blew up, became this whole controversy about transparency. Were these incentives actually benefiting anyone besides a handful of well-connected developers?
It makes you wonder, right? Was Tainan just doing what everyone else is doing, trying to boost development? Or, like the accusers were saying about Lai, was the system ripe for abuse? And the article, it kind of throws out this idea that there might be more to the story, mentioning other allegations about Tainan.
See, that's what gets me. That's the really interesting part. It's like, is this just one isolated incident? Or are we looking at a pattern? Things that maybe weren't technically illegal back then, but ethically? Well, that's a different story. It makes you think, how much power did these local governments actually have? And was there anyone watching to make sure they didn't go too far?
It does seem like that 2014 national cap on those FAR increases, that was a direct response to all of this, right? Like, people were concerned about abuse, about things being different depending on where you were.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just about setting a hard limit. It was about creating a national standard, trying to rein things in. It tells me someone up top was starting to worry about how these local development deals were being handled.
So, let's take a step back for a second, put on our thinking caps. How should we be approaching this whole thing, this case, and others like it? It's easy to get lost in the weeds, the zoning laws, the political back and forth, but what's the bigger picture here?
That's the key, right? We got to look beyond the headlines, the drama. This is about governance, about being transparent, about finding that balance between development and, the people who actually live in these communities, their rights, their well-being.
And we can't forget about context. Like we said, if you don't understand how things worked back then, it's impossible to really judge what Lai did, whether it was right or wrong.
Exactly. We need that historical background, those details about how development regulations have evolved in Taiwan. Was Tainan unusual, or were these big FAR increases more common than we realize? This article, it doesn't really give us that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Which is why, dear listener, you gotta keep digging. Don't worry, we'll have some extra resources in our show notes, things about the history of urban development and regulations in Taiwan, so you can really get into it.
Now, even without all of that historical context, there are still some important things we can take away from this case, things that apply more broadly. First off, development, it's messy, it's complicated, it's never as simple as it seems. You've got economic interests, political agendas, social impacts, it's all tangled up together.
And it shows just how important it is to ask those tough questions. Who's really benefiting from these big projects? Who's paying the price? Are communities being included in these decisions? Decisions that could change their entire neighborhood.
And here's the big one, the most important takeaway. We have to demand transparency. We have to hold our elected officials accountable. We have a right to know how these decisions are being made, especially when they involve public resources, when they have the power to completely reshape our cities.
And that brings us right back to Lai Ching-te. Whatever happens with this case, it's going to stick with him, especially now that he's running for president.
Absolutely. Public opinion, it moves fast, often much faster than the courts.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one question we want our listeners to really sit with?
For me, it comes down to this. Does the Tainan City Government's explanation, this idea that it was just business as usual back then, does that really hold water?
And if it doesn't, what does that tell us about Lai Ching-te, his judgment, his ability to lead?
Those are the questions each listener needs to grapple with, weigh the evidence, and come to their own conclusions.
And as always, we encourage you to seek out different viewpoints. Don't just take our word for it or anyone's word for it, really. Think critically. Engage with the information.
Exactly. Draw your own conclusions. And remember, there might be more to this story than we realize.
It's kind of wild when you think about it, how something from so long ago can suddenly become a big deal. It really puts the spotlight on public figures. And the fact that everything they do, it's like it's under a microscope.
Yeah, foresight. That's the key. Every decision, every policy, it can come back to haunt you, especially these days with social media and everything being so polarized.
It makes you wonder, what else might be lurking out there from Lai's time as mayor? What other decisions might people try to use against him as the election gets closer?
That's politics for you, right? Always unpredictable. You never know what little detail, what connection is suddenly going to blow up. And the context, it's always changing. What seemed unimportant before can suddenly become a major issue.
Makes you realize how tough it must be to be in charge, to make those decisions, especially when you're talking about something as complex as urban development.
Absolutely. Trying to balance the needs of today with what might happen down the road, it's not easy. And as we've seen, sometimes the consequences, they don't show up for years.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do you hope they walk away with?
I think the most important thing is this: be skeptical. And not just about this case, about everything, especially when it comes to politics. Ask the hard questions. Who's saying this? Why are they saying it now? What are they trying to achieve? And remember, there's always more to the story.
It's about being engaged, being informed, and forming your own opinions. Don't just take anyone's word for it, not even ours. Talk to people, read different perspectives, think for yourself.
That's it. And don't forget, this case, as complicated as it is, it's just one small part of a much bigger picture. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those questions.
And that's what we're all about, getting you to think critically and dive deeper. So until next time, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.